Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you.
Hi, I'm Helen Leathers, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Tom Dillon. Hello, Tom. How are you?
I'm very well, Helen. How are you?
I'm very well too, thank you.
Good.
I am looking forward to another podcast episode.
It's a big episode, this one. Well, I say big episode. It's probably not going to be any longer than any other episode, but it's a big topic.
It's a big topic. So we're going to do an overview.
We're going to make a start on the topic. I think there's much more. And actually, this might prompt some questions, some thoughts from our listeners. So we'd be very happy to hear what you think.
Absolutely.
Share your feedback.
Share your thoughts and experiences.
And we'll talk about it more in a future episode.
Brilliant. So just to clarify, this is about burnout.
Burnout, yes.
So I think this is a term that most people will have heard of, especially in the medical profession.
Yeah.
And if they've not experienced it for themselves, they will have had colleagues, patients, friends, perhaps family who have experienced it, because it's such a common term. And I wonder if we're losing sight of what it actually is. So let's start with a bit of a definition. When we're talking about burnout, how are we defining it? Oh, good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the definition I'm going to use is from the kind of original psychologist that started using it, who was Herbert Freudenberger, who defined it as the consequences of severe or prolonged stress and anxiety experienced by people working in the healing professions. That's where he started. That was his starting point. I think it's evolved. I think it's changed a bit, but I don't think that's a bad definition, but it's still quite loose, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like the consequences. What are the consequences? How do we define those consequences? But we'll talk about that more.
It's also focusing solely on healing professions, and I'm probably thinking that burnout is across the board in lots of different professions.
I think it is. I don't know if you were doing a manual occupation, whether you would just end up exhausted. I don't know. It's strange, isn't it? I don't know what the reality of that is.
I know that I've certainly seen people sort of in executive arenas, working for big corporates who suffer with burnout. We know the medical profession suffer with burnout, but if you are perhaps on a production line, would you suffer with different, burnout?
Isn't it? I don't think you would. I think you'd be working hard, perhaps, and I don't know. We'll have to do some research around that.
I wonder if there's an element of the cognitive approach to it as well.
Also having to manage activity and resources and interact with other people. I think there's something about that ends up in a cognitive load that makes life much more difficult.
Yeah.
So just go back to Herbert.
Yes, let's go back to Herbert.
Freudenberger. So he was working with kind of disadvantaged people, and the term was actually borrowed from like 1970s street talk of, people might refer to drug users as being strung out. So burnt out was a phrase that was used on the streets to describe the effects of chronic drug abuse. So that's kind of where it came from in his context.
Right.
And strangely so he was in New York in 1970-ish, and across the other side of the States in California, there was some research being done by Christina Maslach and her colleagues, kind of around the health service sector, and working with service users, and people working in that sector also use the word burnt out, that sort of phraseology. So she came from it independently, didn't know about their own work, each other's work, but both had this. So it's obviously something in the zeitgeist at the time that burnout was a phrase that was being used. There is a book by Graham Greene from, I think, 1953 called The Burnt Out Man. So obviously I don't think he was just a bit disillusioned with life, I think.
Interesting.
So it's a phrase that's been around a while. But But no one really knows how it ended up, other than these two psychologists, how it ended up where we are today.
Okay.
And Freudenberg, there's not a lot more to say about his work. And I think Maslach, because she's still around, Christina Maslach she's now a professor emeritus now, I think. So she's still continuing to do work around burnout. So on the back of the work that she was doing, she explored what was happening for these people that were talking about being burnt out. And what they talked about were three different elements. So one was emotional exhaustion. One was a depersonalization, so a kind of irritability, stepping back from the work that they were doing and engaging with people. So that sort of cynical detachment from the job, and a sense of reduced personal accomplishment. So they were being ineffective and they had low morale around the job that they were doing. Okay. So those were the three elements that she saw as being the ingredients of burnout. And almost to the point that you have to have all three to end up being burnt out.
Okay. Just on that last one,
yeah.
Was it perceived ineffectiveness by the person suffering, or was it actual ineffectiveness?
Well, her phrase was reduced personal accomplishment originally, but it's now become a lack of efficacy. But that I guess other people would notice if you weren't doing your job quite so well, but the sense that you weren't doing your job
yes,
well.
So some people might have a sense that they're not doing their job as well, but they may well be, but perhaps the emotions are.
And I think now
otherwise.
It's taken that the person ends up feeling like, well, I'm a bit rubbish at this, aren't I?
Yeah.
And that could be about the fit with the job. It could just be a bad fit. But that's where we've ended up with those three elements. And interestingly, that the emotional exhaustion seems to have given way a little bit. So it's just exhaustion. But I think there is that combination of emotion, psychological and physical exhaustion all end up in just the exhaustion element. But what she would say is that isn't sufficient to be burnt out. The actual just exhaustion has to go along with the other two in order for it to be described as burnout.
Right.
And she's actually come up with some. So it's strange. I'm very. I always find it interesting when people present research. So Christina Maslach came up with a burnout inventory. So it's known as the Maslach burnout inventory. So it's a questionnaire that you can fill in to see if you're burnt out. And so you score high or low on those three different dimensions. But she has an odd interpretation of it. So if you are high on cynicism, so that depersonalization, so that would result in you being disengaged. So that would just be that's how you would describe someone high on that. If you were high on exhaustion, you'd be described as overextended.
Okay.
So just under too much pressure. If you were high on that negative personal efficacy, so that feeling like you're not doing a good job, you would be seen as ineffective.
Right.
And then if you were positive on all three scores, you would be seen as engaged. So that's engagement. So this is obviously an organisational. She's obviously talking to organisations, isn't she, and saying this is how your people are, and if you've got them in these different camps, this is how we would describe them. And then if you have three negative scores on those dimensions, then you would be seen as burnt out, but it would have to be on all three. Now, what she hasn't presented in her research is what happens if you've got a high score on 2? What do you describe those as?
Yeah, so you could have any.
So there's something missing there. I don't know
combination,
why they've not done that. But you could have a combination of exhausted and cynical, couldn't you?
Yeah, but still being good at your job.
But still be, and I would imagine a lot of medical professionals have that they have a sense of conscientiousness, but are very cynical about the system.
Yeah,
especially within the NHS. I think a lot of people would be very cynical about the system itself and how it operates, but still have a sense that they want to, if not be a perfectionist, they want to do the best they possibly can against all the odds, which obviously makes life very tough. So if you have that perfectionism driver going on for you, but the system is failing you, there's a good chance you're going to end up with a sense of cynicism. You're going to end up exhausted and perhaps feeling like you're not able to do a good job because the resources aren't there for you to do a good job.
Yeah.
which could end up with you being burnt out.
Yeah. And if burnt out means you become ineffective at your job, we don't want a whole NHS system full of ineffective practitioners.
No.
So we want to stop it before it gets to that point.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting is that the term burnt out really only applies to people that have got to that point where it's all falling apart. And I don't think... I think we need to catch people before they get to that point.
Absolutely.
Because if the ultimate experience is that not being able to work at all. So if someone needs 3 months off because they're suffering with burnout, that's then a big problem, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas if we catch them at a place of exhaustion and feeling cynical and maybe worried about their effectiveness, then we can start to do work with them in a coaching sense around how they might put some boundaries in place, look after themselves, some self-care, maybe think about how the system is treating them and what they could do to influence the system.
Yeah.
It's a lot of it's going to be beyond their control, but they might start to think about how they navigate that system. So that's Christina Maslach and her inventory and how she interprets the scores. So she's seen those patterns that come out from people, and I think she's talking to an organisational audience. So saying this is how your people are showing up. But I think there's maybe some more work to do about, what happens if you have got someone who's cynical and exhausted, but is still committed to doing their very best.
So that's one burnout theory, and mainly, arguably, referring to sort of that organisational context. What else have we got?
Well, it's obviously other people have been doing other research into burnout, and there are now 7 different burnout assessment tools that you could engage with. So they're widely available. I'm sure there are others, but there are 7 that are widely available. So one of them measures compassion fatigue and traumatic stress, which again might well apply to many people in the medical profession. Another looks at the different types of burnout, so frenetic burnout, under-challenged burnout. I don't think many medical professionals would suffer from under-challenged burnout.
I wouldn't have thought so, no. Is that more like sort of languishing, like you're not fulfilling something? Yeah.
And I think a lot of people during COVID had that sense of languishing, didn't they? So maybe some under-challenged because they were sent home or working part-time or something.
Yeah.
And I sometimes feel a little bit like that. If there's not a lot going on, I can get that sort of, I need something else. I need something more to kind of spark me. Now, I wouldn't describe myself as being burnt out at all, but sometimes it can be stressful to be under-challenged.
Yeah.
And then the final one for them, so there's 3, frenetic, under-challenged and worn out. So that obviously feeds into that exhaustion. And then another one looks at physical fatigue, cognitive weariness, and emotional exhaustion. So that combination of the 3, which from Maslach's perspective, all fits into exhaustion.
Yes.
She doesn't differentiate between the 3. And then there's the Copenhagen burnout inventory, which looks at personal burnout. So that degree of physical and psychological fatigue based on your experience outside the work context, which could be, for a lot of doctors that are also parents and got busy lives, that could well feed into it, couldn't it? And then work-related burnout, so the level of burnout just based on the workplace and the pressures being put on them by the system and the environment. And then in a medical context, patient-related burnout. So that's evaluating the elements that are directly related with the interactions with patients.
So that is about the medical professional and their relationship with the patient rather than relating to the patients themselves. Yes. Yeah. Just thought I'd clarify that.
Yeah, so those 3 different elements might... So that's a different way of looking at it again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Those different criteria.
Yeah. So tell me more about the work-related burnout then.
So that obviously just focuses on the symptoms of the work environment and the job that you're doing. So say the work environment could actually not be a toxic environment. It could be you're just in the wrong job. And we've talked before about personality types and how, maybe as a as an introvert, if you are in a busy A&E department and there's lots going on and you've got to interact with lots of different people, that could be exhausting just because you're an introvert. So there is a degree to which a good fit personality-wise is going to play into this a little bit. And I'm not saying that's a reason for burnout, but I think it contributes.
Yes.
So if you were in that space, then some of the symptoms that would start to feed into that is feeling tired when you actually think about work, being emotionally exhausted because of the work, just being worn out at the end of the day, not having enough energy for things outside of work. So yeah, feeling exhausted in the morning at the thought of going to work. I think a lot of people have this. And then different to that, the client-related, the patient-related burnout is feeling tired just because of having to interact with other people, having to interact with the clients. So if you've got a particularly difficult set of patients that you're working with, complex needs, and they're just difficult to have conversations with, then I think that's going to be exhausting, isn't it? If you've got a string of those sort of patients coming in front of you, that could easily end up with you feeling exhausted. But they are just talking about really burnout from that experience, not necessarily having the cynicism that Maslow would talk about.
Right, okay. So some different models there. Is there a consensus on what people use in this country as the model of burnout? I think
Maslow is the go-to inventory, the assessment tool that people would use to assess burnout. I don't know, we'll have to ask some medics about that, about what they've used in the past. To be honest, I don't think there's a lot of assessment going on.
Okay.
I think it normally ends up that someone is burnt out before anyone realises that they were burnt out. I think in the meantime, a lot of people are just expected to get on with it. So I think that's still a big problem, that these issues aren't addressed early enough to do good work. So I think definitely, I mean, we know, we've had people on our course, so several people from University Hospital Southampton have come on our course, and they have a doctor's development unit which really is concerned about the care, the well-being of consultants, of senior doctors, because no one is looking after them. The system doesn't look after them. And they've done really good work in coaching and mentoring around those individuals that are under stress, maybe taking time off work, and how can they come back in a way that's safe for them, that isn't going to lead to them feeling burnt out again.
And maybe there's something there about people seeing it as a failure to ask for help or to admit that they're struggling. So it's all about having better conversations sooner, isn't it?
It is, definitely. And again, doesn't seem to be any... When we talk about burnout, and there's so much talk about burnout, and there is so much good work going on in terms of well-being and well-being initiatives. I'm just not sure that it's really all coming together. There's still an awful lot of people that are feeling really stressed and almost on the point of burnout, but are still struggling in that space. So as much as that message is constantly distributed, I'm not sure how much people are actually taking it on. And it's very difficult because within the NHS, the system is so demanding, and we as patients are so demanding. You know, we've got that kind of irony of COVID and the pressure that we know how much pressure medical professionals were under during COVID. So they went through that huge experience of just probably all feeling burnt out at the end of it, and then feeling like, well, we should have some relief now because it's kind of over. But then the system says, and us as patients say, yeah, but you've got all that catching up to do, because now people are dying as a consequence of you not providing the care that, because you couldn't, because COVID was happening.
Yeah.
So crack on, catch up. So
it's that idea, isn't it, in corporate land, where people will say, oh, we're going to do this about well-being, but they don't change the working environment. So there's only so much balancing the well-being initiatives can do if the work environment doesn't change. And that's effectively what you're describing there. these are great initiatives at University of Southampton and other places, but the system's still damaged.
Yes, and there isn't an easy solution
No.
other than throwing more money at it, which doesn't always result in the impact that you would like. But it's a wicked problem, isn't it? How do you resolve that?
Yeah,
and it's so. I don't think the system is going to change sufficiently for people not to feel burnt out. So then it's down to them to take some individual responsibility for how they look after themselves. And they're going to feel pressure, peer pressure to be there and be strong and show up. But there is a point where you have to take responsibility for your own well-being and start putting things in place that support you.
Yeah.
And that might feel like you're letting other people down and putting more pressure on them so they end up. But until people start to change the way they work and put boundaries in place and look after themselves, we're going to still have people coming. So we have a lot of people that come on our course that have ended up taking time off with burnout and struggling to go back to work. Because why would you want to? If you've ended up in an environment where you've been burnt out, why would you go back to that?
Yeah.
But actually, in terms of thinking about it and thinking about boundaries and thinking about how you might manage the environment safely for yourself, a lot of the doctors that come on our course do go back to a clinical role and they're back in the system. But hopefully that they can return to work in a way that's safe for them and doesn't result in them having more time off with burnout.
I feel that it's important to say right now, because some people might be listening to this thinking, God, this is me, I need some help. I hear what you're saying, I think I need to reach out. There are people that coach for this, and we also are able to offer some assistance with free coaching from the people who've been through our training programme.
Yeah, many of whom have suffered from burnout themselves.
Absolutely. So we're going to put a link to our offering on the resources, and if you're thinking now is the time to reach out and get some help before it gets to that point, then fill that form in and we will do our best to set you up with one of our trained coaches to help you through that.
Yeah, and I think just tying this idea of burnout into coaching and where coaching would fit. Obviously, before we get anywhere near burnout, if people are feeling stressed about the workplace and feeling exhausted by the workplace, then coaching can help in terms of encouraging you to think about the boundaries you might put in place and how you look after your own well-being, do some self-care. So that's one area. I think by the time people get to very close to burnout, we can still do good work in the coaching room. So I was coaching someone, it was after COVID, but the consequences of COVID were still having an impact. And this lady that came to coaching, knowing that she was at the point of burnout, just very stressed about everything, feeling like she couldn't cope, total overwhelm. And the first hour I had with her, she just cried through it all because she was so distraught about where she was at. And actually, the last 10 minutes of that conversation were just, coaching will help. We can get through this. This is something that definitely will support you. And she came back to the next session having made some real changes already. Before we did any coaching, she just went away from that conversation thinking, okay, right. And it was like that catharsis of just letting all the emotion around it out and admitting that she wasn't able to cope with what was going on for her, just gave her permission to step back from it all a little bit and say, okay, and she'd had conversations with people that meant that her load was lessened. So when she came back, interestingly, she came back to the next session and said, oh, everything's fine now. And it obviously wasn't. And I think had we not carried on with the coaching, she would have definitely continued on her path to burnout. But we did talk about what she could be doing to look after herself. So that's one instance where someone's at that point. And I had another one years ago before COVID when someone again was just very frazzled. She'd been doing an operational job and been asked to step up to think more strategically while still doing her operational job. So kind of given 2 jobs to do, and had 10 people to manage, to lead, and was just exhausted. Wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping, wasn't exercising, just everything was a mess. And again, had we not had the coaching, and really the solution for her was delegating. She had a team of 10 people, but took it upon herself to do most of the work. And they would come to her desk and say, oh, could you take a look at this for me? And she'd just take it off them. It was their work. And she ended up doing the work because it wasn't right. She'd do it for them. And so there was some degree to which she was inviting burnout by picking up the work that other people could have been doing. So that we can catch people before they burn out. Hopefully we'll catch them long before getting to that really stressed place where they're even thinking about burnout. But if it's just before burnout, we can catch them and do good work in the coaching room. And then if people do end up that they're actually incapable of doing their job anymore, so they're taking time off. And I think that some research needs to be done about how long it takes to recover from burnout. Because we see people on a course that have been off for 3 months and perhaps still aren't ready to go back to work. So it can be a real big strain on the system, can't it, if people having to take that sort of time off. But again, I think coaching can help support them in how they return to work safely and in a way that actually they feel inspired and they want to go back to work. And it might not be back into the role that they were doing.
And to perhaps reignite that passion that they had when they first started in medicine.
And we've certainly had that on our course where people have thought that they were going to leave medicine, but through the coaching that they've had on our course and through thinking about things differently, they've suddenly found a real interest in what they were doing before.
And with some new skills to help them manage themselves. Yeah,
and it is that when you're in the middle of it all, when you're stressed, under pressure, and every day is a crisis, it's very difficult to find the headspace to lift yourself out of that and think, okay, what would it be good to be doing instead? And I think coaching is a great vehicle, a great intervention to help people have the headspace to think properly about the situation.
That feels like a good place to finish.
To pause.
To pause today with that overview, with some pointers, and then to come back on a later episode and explore from the coach's perspective how we can help in that coaching room.
Definitely.
Excellent.
I'm happy with that. I think we've given that a good go just to get us started on talking about burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much. I know you did a lot of reading around this and exploration. So, and I think that we would love to hear thoughts, questions, experiences. So if you are listening and you would like to share any of those with us, we would love to hear from you.
Definitely, because we are very immersed in the world of doctors and the medical profession, and we do have their best interests at heart. So if anyone has any reflections on what burnout meant for them and what the consequences of that were and how they dealt with it, we'd be delighted to hear from you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next time we have got an interview.
We have an interview with the lovely Liz Donovan, who is from the University Hospital Southampton. So what we talk about, she's heavily involved in the Doctors Development Unit, so supporting lots of lovely doctors down there.
It's almost as if we planned it.
It is almost. If only people knew how chaotic it really is. But yes, we will look forward to that, and I'm sure Liz will have lots of interesting things to say about coaching and how that all works for her consultants down in Southampton. So we look forward to that, and we'll see you next time.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.